Thanks again to everyone who is joining us at the virtual table. Here is Laura Washington.
Welcome back, everyone, to At the Virtual Table. We've got a great show, a big show lined up for you tonight. But first, I want to do a little bit of business. As you know, we always take good care of you, and we always make sure you have everything you need online and on paper of the Chicago Sun-Times. We've amped up our digital offerings to bring it all to you wherever you are. If you subscribe to the Sun-Times, you get the new Sun-Times e-paper, a daily digital replica of the print product that lives at paper.suntimes.com. And we have a special digital offer that gives you unlimited access to both the e-paper and every story on suntimes.com for only $2.49 a month. You've got to check us out. You've got to subscribe now. I'm sure many of you are already subscribing to us, but you know where to go. You want to go to Chicago Sun-Times, suntimessubscribe.com. And we're going to remind you a little bit more about that later on because it's a special offer that you cannot afford to miss. And now I want to welcome my At the Virtual Table co-host, Washington Bureau Chief of the Chicago Sun-Times, Lynn Sweet.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everybody out there joining us tonight at the Virtual Table. I'm pleased to introduce to everyone Robert Costa, who many of you must know by now as the co-author with Bob Woodward of the bestseller Peril. Robert is a national political reporter at the Washington Post. He's a former host and moderator of Washington Week on PBS. He's been a political analyst on NBC News and MSNBC. We could claim him almost as a Chicagoan because he is a graduate of Notre Dame. His master's is from the University of Cambridge, and we got to know each other on the campaign trail during the 2012 campaign. I'm going to jump right into it in the news. Robert, thanks for joining us today. As you know, the January 6th committee is expected to subpoena John Eastman next week. That was a significant finding in your book. Could you just give us an update and what you know is the latest about his coming, and briefly explain one of the biggest scoops in your book? And Laura, I know you have questions about the writer's room that our readers wanted to know. Robert, please start us off on the big John Eastman news of tonight.
Lynn and Laura, it's wonderful to be with you. I love the Chicago Sun-Times. Your political coverage is trenchant and excellent. And it was fun being with you in Chicago a few weeks ago, Lynn. But on the Eastman memo, the real story here is that the January 6th committee, it's evident, is expanding its investigation. What began as a process of interviewing Capitol police officers and looking at the violence of the day of January 6th has now become something that's much broader. It's about the planning of an insurrection, both on the ground level in terms of the people who walked up to the Capitol and attacked it, but also those who planned the legal and political battle. And one of those figures is John Eastman, a conservative lawyer who authored a 2-page, 6-point plan that, in a very brief way, outlined what many people are calling a blueprint for a coup d'etat, to throw the election to the House of Representatives. And it's going to be difficult for this January 6th committee, Congressman Kinzinger, the moderate Republican, and others on it, to figure out the facts here, because while we've uncovered some documents and they have some witnesses at this point, a lot of people are not cooperating. President Trump has asserted executive privilege, so they have an uphill climb.
So, Laura, why don't you take over because I know our readers want to get
Sure.
into writers' room questions, and then we'll come back to it. Just wanted to take some top news right off.
Sure, absolutely. There's so much to talk about here. Thanks, Lynn. And Robert, congratulations on this very hot and very important book. Great job. I want to step back for a moment and take our audience into the writer's room, so to speak. One of the things we do with this show is we always try to solicit questions from the audience. And here's we have a great one from the audience to kick this off, and that's coming from Andy Knott. And Andy asks, Bob Woodward has a franchise on these kinds of reporting projects. How did you become his partner on this one?
Bob Woodward and I have known each other for many years. We interviewed Trump together, actually, on March 31st, 2016. 5 years ago, when he was about to become the Republican nominee. We sat down with him for about 90 minutes. And Bob Woodward's first two books on Trump, Fear and Rage, the titles of those books were both taken from quotes from that interview. One quote was, "Real power is fear. Trump said that to us. He also told us he always brings the rage out." So Woodward and I have always had a rapport as colleagues at the Washington Post. We interviewed Trump together. And when he was looking at his third book on Trump on the final days, he said, "Let's do it together." And I thought to myself, why not learn how to write a book from the master himself, Bob Woodward? And he is so old school in his method. Interview people for hours, transcribe it, think it through, build up the scenes.
Well, that was leading right into my next question, which there's something known in Washington is the Woodward method. He's written, what is it, close to a couple dozen books, something like that. And he has a style. Could you expand a little bit more on what that style is and why he's so good at it?
He really drills down to find out what happened and gets to what I call the emotional truth of what really happened, as well as the details that are recounted by eyewitnesses who were in the room or deeply familiar with what happened. And when we did this project, he would guide me from time to time to really understand the context of what was happening. I will give you an example. On January 5th, 2021, the night before the insurrection, we have a scene in the book of Trump opening the door of the Oval Office to listen to the mob outside. He loves the sounds of the mob on the streets of Washington, even though it's a freezing cold night in the city. And he told me that this is important because it shows a president somewhat isolated, turning to his supporters in a crisis moment in his presidency. It reminded him of his own book with Carl Bernstein from 1976, The Final Days, on Richard Nixon. But Nixon wasn't talking to the mob. As you might remember, Nixon was famously, or perhaps infamously, talking to the pictures of presidents on the wall at the White House.
Yeah, that's an eerie parallel there. So you worked on this together. You never worked with him on a book before. You did something like 200 interviews for this book. How did you all approach this as a team, and how did you divide up the work and figure out who was going to do what?
We all have our own sources in journalism, and Woodward and I started off with our different relationships across the board. But as the project went on, we did a lot of interviews together. We would do them in a very discreet way, having people over to his home or my home, rarely over the phone, really trying to talk to people to bring them out of their shells, bring them out of their talking points, to get to that core truth of what really happened. And do you have notes? Do you have a diary you can share, a transcript of a phone call, and push people to share more, to not just be kind of in their talking point public mode. It took a lot of time. At first, when you're writing a book, you think the story may be X, but eventually it becomes Y. And that was really the case with January 6th. We also decided to cover both Biden and Trump, two presidencies, in depth, because it was our belief that, and others may disagree with this framing, that you can't really understand Biden in his moment without understanding Trump. And yet, to understand the final days of Trump, you have to understand who beat him and how that happened. And so we try to present both of those stories as an intertwined storyline.
That's really interesting. And one of the things you said earlier that really struck me is you talk about the emotional aspect of what you're doing. It's not just you want to get people out of those talking points. How do you get people to be emotional? You talk about getting them, sitting down with them in their homes, away from the fray. What other strategies did you use to bring people out?
Let me put it this way. If I sat down with you and asked you about your mother or father, respectfully, you probably have a pat story or two you often tell people you don't really know well about your mother and father. Most people do. And when it comes to current events, it's a lot like that. I'll sit down with someone who was in the White House with Trump or alongside Biden during the campaign, and for 30 minutes, maybe even an hour, they'll give me a nice roundabout story about different events and different people. But Woodward's method, which he taught me, was to keep your rear end on the chair for another hour, a third hour, a fourth hour. And I bet you, and I don't want to bring your family into this, if I asked you about your mother or father for 5 or 6 hours, a little bit of a different story you would be telling by the end of that conversation. We all really want to get to how we really feel about things and what we really saw. It just takes time. And that's the luxury of doing a book. You have time.
Well, in other words, you wear them down.
That's a better way of putting it. Much sharper.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Robert. I'll turn it back over to Lynn.
And thank you, Laura. So, Robert, as you know, so much of the book has provided the underpinnings of the January 6th committee. Take us into the bunker. You write about it. That night in the bunker is now a story that is amplified in the last few days because of the work of the January 6th committee, because of the criminal charges now that may be pending against Steve Bannon for resisting the committee. So you write about this bunker, this setup, and could you tell us about it and then make the connection to the work of the January 6th committee now that they know it happened and what they're trying to excavate in their work?
It's a great question, Lynn. And the January 6th committee has cited our book in its subpoenas for one specific reason, though there are several citations. In our book, we show that on January 5th, Donald Trump is in the Oval Office pressuring Pence to push the election into the House, to throw out electors. He fails to convince Pence to do that. And when he fails, he decides to call in via phone to the war room across the street at the Woodward Hotel in a suite of rooms managed by Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, Trump advisor Jason Miller. The rooms, we later found out through a Washington Post report, were actually being paid for by the Trump campaign. But Trump calls in and he updates the Bannon and Giuliani crowd on Pence. They talk through what to do now. They issue a statement from the campaign in Trump's name, defining Pence as in lockstep with Trump, even though that was a lie. And so by showing in our reporting that Trump was coordinating with Bannon and Giuliani on the eve of the insurrection, we've shown a connection between the presidency and these outside agitators on the Trump legal and political side ahead of January 6th. And that's really important for the committee because it wants to figure out what was the president actually doing. And you have all these different power centers on the right wing of this country colliding, in a sense, on January 5th. Outside of the Woodward Hotel are the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups, Trump supporters. Inside the Woodward Hotel, Bannon and Giuliani, Roger Stone was staying there. And then you have across the street, Donald Trump. And what we tried to figure out is the through line, but there's still more to be reported on, a lot of targets, both for possibly the committee and reporters.
So if you had Eastman, and I guess, again, the news today is that he may get a subpoena next week, you learned a lot just getting his 6-point plan to overturn the election there. What else do you think he knows that the committee needs to know?
Eastman's so pivotal, Lynn, because as our book shows, he was not just some academic writing a memo from the political sidelines. He is part of a chronology that really tells the story of what happened on January 6th. In brief, he's in the Oval Office on January 4th, 2 days before the insurrection, and he presents the argument to Pence to his face with Trump standing next to him. And Trump is saying to Pence, listen to Eastman, listen to Eastman. And they have this scheme legally to throw out electors, delay the certification, and try to get state legislatures to propose alternate slates of electors. It sounds complicated, and I know it can be hard to follow, but to understand it, they basically wanted to stop the certification so Republicans in state legislatures could figure out a way to convince themselves and maybe even the Congress that Trump deserved to win and deserved to be elected in the House, not by the Electoral College. It's a winding plan, but it was very serious.
Right. And John Eastman is a graduate, by the way, of the University of Chicago Law School.
I'm not sure the University of Chicago Law School loves you bringing that up.
It's part of the record. So the work of the committee seems to, the point is they want the information. If Attorney General Merrick Garland decides to pursue criminal charges against Steve Bannon, it could be a long time before we know it, before there's a case, before there's a trial. It seems the committee needs the information more than they need a conviction for Bannon flouting their subpoena. And it now opens the door to see if Eastman is going to do that too. Can the committee in any way, do you think, work around it?
That is the to be determined thing, because you're right. Steve Bannon, knowing him for over a decade as a reporter, may be defiant until the end. As Michael Wolff, the fellow Trump author, the other day said, maybe even Bannon welcomes the idea of going to jail. And I'm not going to contest Michael Wolff's conclusion on that, because there is an aspect of Bannon's personality that welcomes this kind of political and legal warfare. And he certainly does not seem willing to comply with the subpoena in any way. That's why they have the criminal contempt. Eastman remains, well, he's confusing me about where he actually stands on his own memo with all of these different statements that are in private and public about it. Here's what I would say for the committee's success at this point. They need a John Dean. In Watergate, John Dean was the White House counsel for Nixon, and he acknowledged criminality. He put his hand in the air before the Watergate committee and said, I was the White House counsel for Nixon. I committed a crime, and I was part of a conspiracy to commit a crime. When Dean did that, it broke open Watergate because it was someone from the inside acknowledging criminal activity. So far, there has not been a John Dean type witness from inside the Trump circle to say this was a conspiracy.
That's so important. And I can't figure, do you have any candidates? Do you see anyone who would do it?
Well, I know a lot of people who are deeply involved with Trump at the end, but I can't read their moral compass or their willingness to testify. Which
brings us to one of your big conclusions and the title of the book, of course, that we are at a peril and we are at a threat to our democracy. In the last few days, we've seen how President Trump has promised to launch his own media company to challenge Twitter and Facebook. What do you see is the peril amplified if Trump and Trumpism gets this new social media platform and it actually works and they can challenge Twitter or Facebook?
The peril, in my view, as a reporter, is not so much about his social media footprint at this point. It's about his possible ascent again to the presidency. Because when he entered the presidency, he was a total outsider who was somewhat of a novice when it came to utilizing the levers of power. By the end of his presidency, he was fully comfortable with how to pressure the Department of Justice, lawmakers, the vice president. He knew how to wield the hammer of power. And he became very aggressive in using it across the board on the federal level, even the state level. And so the peril is, if this person, Donald Trump, wins the presidency again, what will he do if he actually has power again? Because he's tested American democracy to the extreme. He has tried to contest an election by claiming fraud when there was no fraud, by pushing his entire party to echo him on his claims. And what he's doing right now is he's not formally announced for 2024, but he's out there doing campaign rallies and saying the election was stolen. And so this is not a former president like Nixon who gets on a helicopter, or Jimmy Carter who goes back to planes, or the Bushes who go back to Texas. This is someone who wants back in the arena.
Well, and he's pretty effective too. Your book sets the stage for this next chapter that we're in, where we have the various challenges to election laws going on right now, Robert. We have, in a sense, laying the groundwork for Republicans to challenge elections before they're happening and change the way that we vote. Also, do you find it interesting that we now are in a stage where people who are the election deniers also become the anti-maskers and the anti-vaxxers?
It's something I encounter as a reporter all the time. I'll walk up to people at events, even in a COVID time, and they will say to me, "Oh, you're with the mainstream media. You are fake news." And that it's become more visceral and angry in the last 5 years in a way it wasn't even 10 years ago when you and I were first meeting each other and talking on the campaign trail. We have such a deeply divided country where faith in institutions has eroded to the raw bone, and there's really not a lot of it there. People are in their own political orbits on social media, in social circles. We're even more isolated with a pandemic. So my optimism is not really there in terms of a national consensus on facts or a political reality. But I do think it's important to just stay cool and focus on the democratic issues and the democratic truth out there, not in the party sense, but in a broader fundamental civic sense.
So do you think, you write a lot about Mike Pence and you have that, what was one of the first big stories out of the book that he got and how he was pressured so much to do something to throw the election, and he didn't. Okay, so he is laying the groundwork in a way for his own run for president. Do you have a sense that he has the backbone to run if Trump decides to get in the race?
I don't want to predict anything because who knows what happens, but I don't see him as a likely contender or a major contender if Trump runs. At this point, it looks like a lot of people from Secretary of State Pompeo to Mike Pence to Ron DeSantis of Florida are all positioning themselves for the possibility that Trump, for whatever reason, chooses not to run in 2024. And they want to be positioned to be the inheritors, the successors to the Trump movement, the Trump political power. But it's hard for them to have any kind of competing political capital at this point against this major global celebrity who has a mass movement behind him on the right.
And isn't it amazing, no matter what the revelations are in your book from the January 6th committee, what other reporters are getting, nothing seems to make a dent in the growth of Trumpism. I mean, we see it in a lot of parts of Illinois, northern Illinois. Chicagoans are a little inoculated against it because it is so Democratic. But, downstate Illinois, in far northern Illinois in McHenry County, we have strong pockets of not only people who voted for Trump, that I get, just in electing someone, but this Trumpism is sticking, and then this Trumpism feeds into the election denial that feeds into this whole thing.
But Lynn, I would jump on that and add to that. Yes, it's out there, but is that, and put the question to Robert, is that enough for even if Trump runs for re-election, even if he whips all that up again, is that enough? When I see the polls don't reflect that most people support that the election should be overturned, and most people do not support the idea that it was stolen. Most people do not support that we shouldn't get vaccinated. So is there enough out there in terms of the political landscape, in terms of the support that he might be able to gain for him to really have a chance to win the presidency?
Well, he's definitely in position to win the Republican nomination. There were some disasters on Trump's part in 2020. For the Republicans to lose Georgia Senate seats in a red part of the South, even though Georgia is changing in a rapid way in some respects demographically, it was a political crisis for the GOP in 2020 in terms of where they lost. But let's not forget, to answer your question and Lynn's, that Donald Trump changed the Republican Party, made it anti-free trade, or at least protectionist on trade. He became much more incendiary and hard right on immigration, non-interventionist on foreign policy. And so he created a new message for a Republican Party that had grown sclerotic and politically brittle during the Romney nomination and the years after that. He reinvigorated it politically in terms of going into the Midwest again and having support because of how it framed itself on immigration and trade. And it is interesting that support and appeal has remained, even though he was impeached twice, connected to an insurrection, and based on our reporting, shredded and tested every single democratic norm in this country. Despite all that, the political appeal I outlined still seems to have a lot of strength with some voters, swing voters in places like Southern Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, etc.
So in other words, his supporters are willing to overlook the impeachments, the insurrections, et cetera, because they believe fundamentally in his version of republicanism.
And they may not even believe in his republicanism. He's not for cutting social spending, unlike Romney and Ryan and all these other Republicans. But he gives the Republicans enough of what they want, which is an overhaul of the federal judiciary, low taxes. But what's part of Trump's appeal, and I've covered him for years, is he is not so much a political figure to many people, but a cultural figure. And he represents to them, he's a weaponization of their anger against what they see as establishment and elite culture. So they forgive him for so much of his conduct, which many voters find appalling, and some Republicans even find appalling. But because he has cultural resonance, there's a lot of defensiveness among his core voters.
See, one of the things that came out of the Trump era in the beginning, reporters did fact checks, reality checks. First, they lagged by a few days, then real time. Everybody's got it down. The idea that there is, and I've talked to Trump supporters, I'm sure, Laura, we all have. Sometimes I wonder if people could agree in these interviews of today is Thursday, because it's deeper than just distrust of the press. I would think there would be one day maybe there'd be a way of figuring it out better. But I hate to say this, we have not figured out, have we, a way to, as reporters, to even make a dent into just this untruthfulness, the fact-based statements that are factless that Trump puts out there. In your reporting, have you come upon any method? I'm just curious.
Well, you just got to keep reporting, and you're doing it, Lynn. And we just have to keep shining a light on both Republicans and Democrats and what they're doing, but especially with Republicans right now who are really testing democracy in some of these states. We got to really make sure we cover all of that activity in the states, cover both parties in a civil but very aggressive way. And that I think sometimes the civil and aggressive approach allows, if you just show Republican voters who are obsessed with Trump the facts of what he did, you can't turn away from hard facts.
Well, except I cover Adam Kinzinger pretty heavily, and that's what he's been trying to do for months. And it still has only earned him it has only earned him perhaps a one-way ticket out of elected office in Illinois, where his political future is tough right now because of the growing strength of Trump Republicans. Everything you said is what Congressman Kinzinger is trying to do: lay out facts, get rid of conspiracy, to address frontal conspiracy theories. But I haven't seen the reaction in a big grassroots way that perhaps the congressman thought. And that is something you talked a lot about, as we're in our final minutes here, Robert, about this democracy crisis in this country. Are we in a crisis now that is shows any sign of abating? And is it all tied at this point to whether or not Trump decides to run for president?
The crisis, in brief, to me, is something that looms ahead of 2024. The John Eastman memo outlined a plan to throw the election to the House by saying there were alternate electors out there. Of course, there were not alternate electors out there in 2020 or 2021. What happens next time if there are? In other words, if Republicans are more organized in the states and have state legislatures ready to throw new alternate electors to Congress ahead of the certification, you could have a constitutional crisis about which electors should be counted, who actually won the election. And the ultimate constitutional crisis would be two people showing up to the inauguration claiming to be president with no real answer if Congress isn't certified or it's not seen as a credible certification. And to me, it's almost like that movie Star Wars, where there's that one gap in the system for the Death Star, the big ship. in American democracy, there is a gap here. If people manipulate the electors and how it's certified in Congress, you could see a major constitutional crisis not that far away. I'm not a doomsday person, but I do think about the Eastman memo and what if a few things had changed, what could have happened this time and what could happen next time.
So Robert, as we close this out, the whole point now of the Eastman memo may be not that it's something that happened in the past, but what he did in those 6 pages is set up the prologue for the future.
Well, we shall see. The New York Times did say this book reads a lot like prologue for the future, but we'll have to just keep tracking it. And as you do at the Chicago Sun-Times, just keep reporting, tell the story.
And we'll do that. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great to have you, Robert, and maybe we'll be seeing a sequel from you, depending on how things work out. Look forward to seeing that.
Thank you.
So we're going to move right ahead into this next segment. That was a great first half hour. We're going to have even better second half hour. We're going to be hearing from what I call the Vice Squad of the Chicago Sun-Times. And we're not talking about Miami Vice. We're talking about right here in Chicago, the weed and gambling scene, which is covered ably by Tom Schuba and Mitchell Armentrout. Just going to give brief introductions, and then we're going to get into it. Mitchell Armentrout is a staff reporter and occasional assistant Metro editor for the Chicago Sun-Times. He joined the newspaper in 2013. He covers state and local politics in Illinois and Chicago, especially surrounding the expansion of gambling in Illinois, and including the addition of 6 new casinos and a burgeoning legal sports betting industry. Welcome, Mitchell.
Thanks so much for having me, Laura and Lynn. It's a real honor.
Thank you. And Tom Schuba has been a staff reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times since 2017, where he covers breaking news, crime, and the exploding cannabis industry. This year, his work on the pot beat earned him a Peter Lisagor Award and 2 first-place honors in the Illinois Press Association's Editorial Excellence Contest. Tom lives in Avondale with his wife, Nina, and their 10-month-old daughter, Edith. Hi there, Tom. Good to have you with us. And so before we get into Vice, I wanted to chat with Lynn for a minute about hot topics, hot action in Springfield today, particularly around redistricting. It's been a seesaw week and a seesaw day in terms of the remap. There's already been 3 maps out there at my last count, and things are still up in the air, and it's all been very controversial. Lynn, where do things stand?
Well, I'm working right now with political writer Rachel Pitt to nail this down. This has to do with the congressional map and how the Democratic leaders at this moment don't have the votes to pass the congressional map. They came out with the 3rd version at 10 o'clock last night or thereabouts, and the Senate, in a way that just goes across all kind of good civic behavior, they called a public hearing at 10 a.m. Chicago time. Imagine that, a 3rd draft of a map comes out, there were some changes, and they have a public hearing just hours later. Well, some people who I guess press the refresh button all the time were able to come and testify. But here's the bottom line. The legislature right now is in what is called the veto session. And both in the State House and the State Senate, when you're in the veto session, that means that you have to have a supermajority to pass anything. Well, in the House, Speaker Welch has a supermajority, but he has no margin to lose some votes. And different House members, State House members, for different reasons, have problems with the map. Speaker Welch can't advance a map and have a losing vote on it. There's probably no reason for it. Some of the people who are trying to change the map the mightiest are the 2 Democrats who were thrown in the same district. That's Marie Newman and Sean Casten. Casten is trying to work some of his pressure in Springfield. I'm not sure what his solution is because there is no will right now to decouple Newman and Casten. All this to create a new Hispanic influence district. Bottom line, before we get to Mitch and Tom and our Vice Squad, is if they can't figure this out, then this map gets kicked into January when you only need a majority to pass it. That could happen, but it will also create chaos in getting people up and running and getting petitions passed to get ready for the June primary. So that's the latest right now. I'll be making more calls and doing some more reporting. We're real close to deadline right after the show. Laura, back to you.
Well, yeah, and I guess, Lynn, a couple quick things. And one is that, one of the curious things about this is you're right. The effort is to create a second Latino or Latino influential congressional district, but the representative of the one district that we have now that's represented by a Latino, Chuy Garcia, has been pretty quiet on the whole thing, and there's some feeling that he's not necessarily interested in having a second Latino district if it's going to pull Latino constituents away from him. What's behind that?
The numbers tell the story. He has a 60% voting age population in what would be his South Side base district. The Hispanic North Side district that's being carved out would have about 43, 44. I think they added, the map makers added a few precincts to bring it up a bit, still not a majority. That's why we call it a Hispanic influence. And the bonus that the map makers gave to Garcia was throwing in Midway Airport, which he wanted to represent. I think his political survival is pretty
assured.
It's, look at, no one owns these seats, which you have to remember. These maps are also being made for a new generation who might want to come up and grab some of these seats themselves, and those are members of the legislature. The members of Congress are not the most important people to the state House and state Senate members. And boy, are they finding that out now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Garcia tried to just have his one district, to have his district kept kind of intact. He was able to survive the first round, not the second.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's more to come, and we look forward to seeing your story from you and Rachel tomorrow morning, if not tonight. Thanks, Lynn. And so now I want to go back to Mitchell and Tom, and why don't each of you, if you would, share what's the hot headline for you? What's the breaking news or soon be breaking news on each one of your beats? I'll start with you, Mitchell.
Well, there's a lot going on in the world of Illinois gambling. Tomorrow is the application deadline for developers to submit bids to the city of Chicago to build a casino. It's something that mayors have tried to get for decades, going back to Richard M. And it looks like it's finally happening in Chicago, but it's been a long road since that legislation passed in Springfield back in 2019. And it's actually unclear exactly how many developers are even going to submit bids for the Chicago casino, because obviously the tax rates on that are pretty high, according to some industry analysts. Of course, any tax rate is too high for a lot of industry analysts, so it's kind of hard to put into context exactly how sincere that judgment is. But tomorrow we expect to see at least get an idea of how high the interest is in running that casino downtown. And at the same time, the state regulators are also vetting potential developers for 2 additional casinos in the suburbs, one in Waukegan and then one in the south suburbs. So there's a total of 4 groups vying for those 2 licenses. So things are pretty hot across the board over here.
Well, as you point out, the Chicago casino has been decades in the making, and so many efforts have failed in the past. So assuming that it's really going to take off this time, that these bids are going to fly, or one of these bids is going to fly, what's your outlook on how long all this is going to take? This is, I suspect that the mayor's been wanting to put some casino revenue in every budget she's had so far. And when do you think that the casino will actually there'll be some ground broken, or it'll actually get off the ground?
That's the $5 billion question, I guess, because the revenue from this casino is going to be earmarked for police and firefighter pension funds. But yeah, when will the city start collecting on that? It's going to be at least we're only at the stage where developers are putting in their bids. You've got to think it's going to take at least 6 to 8 months for the city to land on a choice, and then from there the city forwards it to the state. And they've already taken more than 2 years to evaluate bids that were submitted for other jurisdictions. So, you're looking at the short end, you're looking at 2 years maybe for this to get off the ground. Maybe some of the developers will offer fast track plans. We'll see, but this is still something that's definitely in the pipeline, and it's not particularly close, but it's closer than it's ever been before for the city.
Yeah,
So the
for
mayor's
sure.
got that.
For sure. I know you're going to continue to watch it for us. Thank you. And Tom, how about you? What's the headline, the hot topic for you on pot these days?
We're kind of still stuck in a state of gridlock over some really lucrative dispensary licenses, which were a really big part of legalizing recreational weed. Was this idea of, we're going to do this and we're going to equitably issue these. We're going to try to give them to people who are from areas that have been most harmed by past weed enforcement. So that would
be communities of color, minority communities, because of disparities in enforcement of weed laws.
Precisely, right? And unfortunately, legally they weren't able to do this along racial lines. So how they had to do this was to say through these Bureau of Labor Statistics regions and pick them out. And either you had to be from there or you had to have a past cannabis arrest or conviction. There were specific ways that you could apply or could qualify as a so-called social equity applicant. And the idea was to prioritize these licenses to these folks because as it stands right now, the marijuana industry in Illinois is very white, it's very corporate, and as we speak, recreational marijuana sales have now probably surpassed $1 billion for the year.
Wow.
So it's a huge amount of money. What's happened is there's been huge amount of blowback over how the licensing processes went. That's resulted in just a steady stream of lawsuits. What's happened now is the Illinois Supreme Court is trying to consolidate some of these lawsuits to make it a little bit more manageable, because as it stands, it's just a complete and utter mess.
Mm.
They have named the winners of 185 dispensary licenses, but there's a court case in Cook County that's holding up the issuance of those licenses. And there was a hearing in that case today that was kind of laughable, because it was just so, it didn't seem like anyone really had an answer of what happens next with the consolidation of these cases. You have the Attorney General's office kind of having proposals for how to move forward. You have the judge kind of saying, whoa, step back. First, we have to hear from everyone who's involved and who may want to be involved. Because you had all these attorneys kind of chomping at the bit and saying, well, we filed a lawsuit too, and we want to be in the consolidated case too. So there's this drama that is, underpinned by this issue of the state not meeting its goal of, really diversifying this really burgeoning, developing industry.
So what went wrong? I mean, there were good intentions, and everyone agreed that that they wanted to make sure the communities of color, disenfranchised communities were going to benefit. So how did it all go awry?
It seems like there was some issues with the grading of the applications at first. The state has spent millions and millions of dollars to the global accounting firm KPMG to grade those applications. When they first announced who the finalists were, they had a lottery process to actually issue the licenses or to dole out the licenses. There was a lot of criticism because only 21 of hundreds of groups were named as finalists. So when that happened, Pritzker kind of drew back and said, okay, well, we'll have this kind of secondary application process where we'll, give other people a chance to get stuff double checked. And so they went through that process. They added more than double the amount of new licenses through new legislation. They tried to redefine what social equity is for some of those new licenses and moving forward. And yet we're kind of still stuck here. And what happened now was they had a lottery process that was conducted by the Illinois Lottery. And it appears that there were problems with that lottery process, where people who should have been in the lottery were not included in the lottery. And so what they have to do now is have what they're calling a simulated lottery to give those people the same odds of winning the licenses, and then they will issue new licenses to those people. So it's very convoluted, and it's left people really frustrated. So, you know, there are people who were named winners, and they want to know, can we get property? Can we secure property? Can we get zoning? In Chicago, it's, you know, they you know, changed the zoning rules, but it's still onerous. You still have to get zoning changes in some cases if you want to move into certain neighborhoods, certain areas. And then other people want to know, can I sell this thing? Because it's worth a ton of money, and I've been sitting around and I've been burning money waiting on this process, and I want to know if I can offload this thing.
Sounds like a lot more lawsuits to come, actually.
I'm sure there's probably been one filed since I've been talking.
So also, and Mitch, there's equity issues even in any expansion of sports betting, stemming from the first days of allowing riverboat gambling in Illinois. Why is this town, and Mitch, so tough to figure out how to do it right? Mitch, can you go first? What in gambling? I mean, actually, it looks like now your gambling beat should be running the second lottery draw for the weed licenses. But anyway, you know, this equity issue, getting licenses from all aspects of your beat, to the new casinos that opened up, to allowing sports betting. What's the problem?
You know, as far as casinos, you know, it's kind of interesting. As far as the South Suburban casino specifically, you know, that's people have been talking about bringing a casino to Chicago's South suburbs as long as they've been talking about bringing one to Chicago. And you know, it's viewed sort of as this beacon of economic prosperity for you know, largely Black South suburbs that have been left behind in other respects, that haven't been invested in. And you know, even now that they've finally landed this casino, there's a lot of consternation among some of these suburbs that, well, there's not, you know, so this, in the 2019 expansion, the state created 6 new casino licenses. The other 5 are earmarked for specific suburbs or cities: Chicago, Waukegan, Danville, Rockford. But when it comes to the South suburbs, who've been looking for this casino for decades, you know, they're still left to sort of fight for it amongst 5 or 6 different townships. So, and even, you know, once the revenue does start coming in down the line, you know, a lot of those funds are going to be sort of parceled out in smaller chunks among 42 suburbs in the region. So, you know, you've got to give lawmakers credit for you know, finally making it happen, but it does raise more questions about, you know, how much is this actually going to benefit a lot of these suburbs, and how is that going to balance against, you know, the social costs of that, with gambling addiction and you know, crime that is often associated with you know, proximity to casinos.
So when we talk about the suburbs, you wrote a story recently about the Bears, as we all know, are thinking about going to Arlington Park, now the racetrack. And so Churchill Downs is a player to create a racino at Arlington Park. What's going to happen in that? And could you tell our viewers what exactly is a racino anyway?
So you've opened a whole other can of worms there, Lynn. You've got a lot of horsemen and horsewomen in fighting formation with that. So basically, racinos were, just as, you know, these casinos are being kind of held out as, you know, a light of hope for folks in the South suburbs and other economically depressed regions. The state's horse racing industry has been dying a very slow death for, you know, a good 30 or 40 years now. So as part of the gambling expansion, lawmakers have allowed the state's two remaining horse racing tracks to offer slot machines and casino table games, so they can become racinos. It's a little play on casinos, as a means of supplementing, you know, these purses that the horsemen have just been shrinking for years and years as more folks have left the state. I should say, you know, horse racing owners and trainers have gone to other states.
You know, would have to if I walked into a racino, if it existed in Arlington Park, I could place horse bets and maybe watch the ponies, but I could do blackjack, the slots, or whatever my game is.
Yeah, it would be a one-stop shop. Yeah,
And a sports book too?
correct. Yeah. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. Here 2.5 years after the legislation passed, very controversially, Churchill Downs passed on the opportunity to open a racino, even though they'd spent years lobbying for that exact privilege.
Why?
Well, if you ask them, they would say that it's because the taxes are too high compared to casinos and other video gaming terminals. But if you ask a lot of the folks, or if you use common sense or business sense, I guess, Churchill Downs also owns Rivers Casino, which is not very far from Arlington Park, and which is the state's most lucrative casino by a long shot.
By O'Hare.
It's generating hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It's twice as productive as the next casino in the state. So the horsemen and the trainers, they've accused Churchill Downs of just trying to protect from any potential competition arising against Rivers. They're trying to protect that investment. So that all came to a head last month, as you said, Lynn, when Churchill Downs sold the land to the Bears, who are now exploring the possibility of opening a stadium. And that's another long project that we're following closely.
Well, it keeps reporters busy, and it keeps those paychecks coming in, so that's important. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I want to ask both of you. Tom, starting with you, you said that we were bringing in $1 billion this year in revenues and recreational marijuana. Is there a saturation point, or is there a point where the demand, the supply outruns the demand, or where do you see that happening on the pot scene? And I would ask Mitchell the same thing about gambling.
There's much more illegal weed still being sold in Illinois. And the key reason for that is because the legal weed is extraordinarily expensive. Less so if you're a medical marijuana user where you can dodge some of the taxes. But still, in that case, much more expensive than the illicit weed.
Could you give me some? Could you give me some comparables? I'm sure you've been out there checking it out yourself personally, right? In terms of what it would be like legal versus illegal, in terms of percentages, or
kind of the baseline for if you're talking about flower, which is like weed, what probably an old school person like you understands it as. Now we have all these vapes and edibles and stuff, but weed, flower, an eighth of an ounce of that. Baseline is about $60 pre-tax, and probably around $80 after tax then for that amount of marijuana. You could probably get that from a solid street dealer who's probably getting it from Colorado or California for about $30. No tax.
Big difference. Big difference.
So the taxes are going to fund things that are important for reaching the equity goals. Drug treatment and various other causes. So there's a bunch of different kind of pools where that money is going to. But you would think at the start of marijuana legalization there was real supply issues, especially with the flower. There's a limited number of cultivators still. So they really just weren't ready to meet this new demand when recreational sales first started. From what I understand, supply has really ramped up, and there is a lot of supply, but the prices haven't come down at all. So, understanding the supply side economics of it all and why that is, I don't know. Maybe there's companies were taking a lot of losses at the start. Just to keep things going and to establish their brands as people first started to come into the legal marketplace. But that's kind of a really big issue right now. Is that,
Tom, Congress has not allowed the legal weed industry, legal in Illinois and legal in but not everywhere. We don't have it is not legal federally to buy weed. Then because of that, the weed industry can't use most banks. I don't see any change coming in Congress right away because they've got their hands full. Another story is breaking tonight. about whether or not President Biden can get even his infrastructure and budget bill going. And the answer is, for the moment, it seems no. But what kind of an impediment is it to the industry not to have banks, but yet it is still growing? How are they working that out? And at some point, to really have a thriving industry, do you think there needs to be
It is an impediment, and I think
to have a federal, you have to allow these companies access to banking?
yeah. So there's been different proposals, right? The big one has been like safe banking, and so there's been some thinking to say, let's detach the banking issue from what they're calling federal decriminalization, what advocates are calling federal legalization. And the detaching those two things is supported, I think, by the industry, existing industry, who says, we need to get this done because this is will kind of change the game for them. And then you have advocates saying, well, then there won't be much impetus to do both if we do that first. So yeah, it's kind of hung up. It's a weird thing where you have a figure as influential as Chuck Schumer touting to kind of go the full way with this thing, and he really earlier this year got in front of this and
Right.
tried to become the face of it. And it didn't really go anywhere. And it seems strange to me, Biden has never really owned this, but maybe with his approval numbers sinking, it'll kind of, on the political side say, well, marijuana is popular. Probably popular with swing voters, So maybe as we get closer to the election, there'll be more of a motivation, from the Oval Office to do something with this.
Well, I don't see that right now. So, Mitch, my question to you: in what is the biggest part of sports, of gambling growth? I mean, a mega casino obviously is big, whether it's in the south suburbs or Waukegan. Is it poker machines? Is it the sports book? Within the industry, where is Illinois going in terms of growth?
Well, for now, the growth has definitely been in sports betting. There's only about 20, last I checked, we're now up to 24 states, and that includes Washington, D.C., that allows sports betting or has legal sports betting. And Illinois is very quickly, the industry launched here in March 2020, right before the pandemic started. And even despite, several months without any sports, Illinois is already the number 2 or 3 market in the whole nation, as far as just in terms of the amount of money that folks are spending or betting. And, I think the industry certainly thinks that there's still more room to grow there. And I think that's a good thing, because there's really not a heck of a lot elsewhere for the state to grow gambling wise. I mean, if you count the number of places where you can place a bet in Illinois, there's by far more places to bet here than there are across all of Nevada. And I'm not talking about casinos. Obviously, Nevada's got hundreds of casinos. We've only got 10, or as many as 16 once this expansion, if it comes to completion. But you drive around the suburbs or downstate, and you'll see video gaming lounges at bars and restaurants everywhere. Or at least in suburbs and municipalities that allow it. So that's almost 8,000 establishments statewide. And that's about almost 40,000 machines outside of casinos. Each casino has about 16,000 machines inside. So at some point, in a state with more places to gamble than Vegas, you've got to wonder, how much, what are those diminishing returns going to look like when there are, 5 or 6 new casinos? How much can you split that pie up? Obviously a lot of folks see potential in, drawing tourists in downtown Chicago. That's definitely a draw. But, it's, not to put too fine a point on it, but it feels like it's a pretty big gamble for, a city like downstate Danville, that is, just seen its population decimated in the last half century. And there's looking for any sort of, economic engine to grasp onto. But we'll see how much it works out for them.
Well, so we have to roll out. You guys are just fonts of knowledge on these topics. And I guess our closing question is, what's your favorite part of the job, given that you're both on the vice beat? Tom, what's your favorite part? Do you sample the products as part of your research?
Do I like marijuana? Is this? Sure, yeah, of course, it's great. I think like now that we're into a state of kind of like normalization with weed, it's gonna just become more and more common of, now my dad, for example, an old boomer, he's a medical marijuana user in Michigan, and I'll smoke weed with him sometimes now. So that's how,
It's another way to have a father-son relationship. I love it.
they are changing,
What about you, Mitchell?
I was going to say, actually, it was fun last Christmas. Actually, I did go out to the dispensary, and the whole family got weed products for Christmas. It was fun. I got some honey flavored weed packets for my mom, and they make like ranch dressing packets. They make everything. It's very impressive. But yeah, for me personally, I am a big sports fan myself, so I was very excited to see the state legalize it a couple of years ago. But as far as the job itself, I just consider myself lucky to be able to work with folks like you, Lynn, and Tom, and our top political reporter, Rachel Hinton. Every day is a blast. It's fun.
Well, it's been a blast having both of you. Thanks so much. And thank you, Lynn. Lynn, you want to take us out?
Right. Thank you, Laura, and Tom and Mitch. Thanks so much. I hope the Vice Squad keeps on doing the very deep and serious reporting, big economic, big social, big cultural issues that both of you address on a daily, and equity issues that both of you address on a daily basis. I also want to thank again Robert Costa for being our guest. And as everyone who watches this show knows, at the very end, in order to make this show possible, we need people like you, our supporters, to go out and subscribe to the Chicago Sun-Times. I'd say every month that the replica, the e-edition of the paper, is what I start out with every day here in Washington, D.C. You could get the Sun-Times e-paper, which is a daily digital replica of the print product. It lives at paper.suntimes.com. We have a special digital offer that gives you unlimited access to both the e-paper and every story on the suntimes.com for only $2.49. You have on the screen where you need to go, suntimes.com/subscribe. And until next time on At the Virtual Table, mark your calendars, November 18. I want to say good night to you, and Laura, take it away.
Thanks, Lynn. Good night to everybody. We'll see you next month, November 18th. Don't miss it.